To be honest, I never thought a cold piece of iron intended to move people between floors would one day become their death cage and send me to the bottom of the pit of eternity. My name is Lucas. I'm 35 years old, and it's been a few months since I took the job as the caretaker of this godforsaken tower. Looking from the outside, it's a chic and modern building, the kind with penthouses at the top where wealthy people walk around. But from the inside, if you press your ear against the walls, it's as if you hear the sound of wailing. It smells of corpses here, the smell of staleness, the smell of something that shouldn't exist. Everything began for me at that cursed hour, 2 a.m. On that first night, I thought I must be hallucinating or seeing things wrong because I was exhausted. I was sitting in the cramped, Sauergard booth, a glass of bitter tea in my hand, messing around with the low-quality CCTV monitors, when suddenly my eyes fell on the floor indicator. I saw the elevator light freeze on the 4th floor. It was exactly 2 o'clock. No one had gone up, and no one had pressed the button. No matter how much I hit the call button from down there, it wouldn't come down, nor would it go up. It was as if someone from the other side, with a horrific force, was holding the door to keep it from closing. The next morning, I found out the old woman in Unit 402, Mrs. Elena, had suffered a stroke in her sleep. But when the police came out, their faces were as white as chalk. They said Elena died as if, before her heart stopped, she had seen something that caused her heart to shrivel inside her chest. Her eyes remained so wide open that her sockets had hemorrhaged. Her face was bruised, but not from illness. It was as if someone with cold, bony hands had squeezed her throat so hard they hadn't even let her utter a single groan. On the second night, the same thing happened again. Sleep would no longer come to my eyes. I was staring at the digital clock on the desk. Just as the second hand slid onto the number 12 and it became 2 a.m., the loud, lingering sound of elevator cables being pulled echoed through the hallway. It was as if a weight of several tons was being moved. The elevator went up slowly, and this time locked on the 7th floor. My stomach was churning like vinegar. My hands were shaking, but I grabbed my flashlight and headed out. The stairs seemed endless that night. The more I went up, the further the 7th floor seemed. When I reached the hallway, the air was so cold I could see my own breath, a bone-chilling cold that was not natural at all. The elevator was there, its doors closed, but from the gap in the door, a scratching sound came that tore at my liver. It was as if someone was scratching and clawing their long, sharp nails against the metal walls. Across from the elevator lived the Marco family. Marco was a kind man with 2 young children. When morning came, the lobby was filled with officers and ambulances. I didn't dare go up, but I overheard from the investigators words that every wall of Unit 701 was painted with blood. They said their bodies had been torn into pieces as if they had been put through a meat grinder. But the most terrifying part was that all the doors and windows were locked from the inside. There was no way in, unless death had stepped out from inside the elevator itself. Slowly, I realized that this was a game where one side was an iron machine and the other side was hungry spirits. Having grown weary of my own life, I began searching through the nooks and crannies of the basement. Amidst a heap of old blueprints and moldy papers, I found a diary with a cover made of old leather. It belonged to the original architect of the building, a madman who had vanished years ago. He had written that this tower was built on the grounds of an old torture chamber, a place where centuries ago, people were buried alive inside its walls. He wrote that he had designed the elevator shaft to act like a respiratory duct for that underworld. That architect had written that every night at 2 a.m., when the boundary between the world of the living and the dead becomes thin, the elevator sets off to choose its victim. It seeks out the most sinful or the most fearful soul. The weight of human terror acts like a magnet, pulling the elevator toward itself, and it stops there to open the doors of hell onto that home. That was when I understood why it stops in front of a house every night. Because that cabin is a scale that weighs the heaviness of the residents' souls. One night, it was the 9th floor's turn. I didn't go up anymore. I just stared at camera number 9 from behind the monitor, which was filled with static and noise. I saw the elevator door open very smoothly. The hallway lights began to flicker, and then all of them burned out at once. From the absolute darkness of the cabin, a tall creature emerged. Its skin was like burnt paper, and its arms reached all the way to the ground. That creature headed toward Unit 901, where a lonely man named James lived. James wasn't a bad man, but he was always afraid of loneliness, and that very fear was the scent of delicious meat for that monster. The monitor suddenly cut off, but I heard James's scream through the guard speaker. A long, drawn-out scream, as if they were peeling his skin away from his body inch by inch. When I got there, the smell of burnt flesh and sulfur had taken over the hallway. James had disappeared. Only a thick trail of blood stretched from the door of his house to the inside of the elevator shaft. It was as if they had taken him back to where they came from. Now, every night had become a literal hell for me. When it reached 1:30, my body would start shaking and my teeth would chatter. I could feel the cold smell of iron and blood in the entire lobby. I understood that those creatures, those jinns and tormented spirits, were getting closer to me. First, they play with your mind. They send black shadows into the mirrors of your home. Then suddenly they cut the power, leaving you with the sound of cold breaths heard from behind your head. They enjoyed my fear. It was as if they were preparing me for the main course. Once, in the bathroom mirror, instead of my own reflection, I saw Marco's face smiling at me, while his jaw hung loose and worms crawled out of his mouth. They wanted to drive me to madness before my turn arrived. Tonight is the worst night of my life. Ever since the sun went down, I felt a strange heaviness on my chest. It's as if the lobby air has run out, and I'm drowning in a pool emptied of water. It is now 1:59 a.m. I am staring at the central monitor. My hand is frozen on the edge of the desk. Suddenly, all the monitors burned out together, and the sound of light bulbs exploding rang out. In that thick darkness, the only thing I could see was the red light above the elevator door, blinking like the eye of a demon. The sound of moving cables came, a heavy, muffled sound, as if they were dragging a large coffin on the floor. The floor indicator began to spin. Floor 1, 2, 3. No, it stopped. The elevator didn't come up. The elevator was coming down, straight toward the ground floor, right where I was standing. The famous ding of the elevator, in this silence, was like the tolling of a death knell. The doors opened very slowly, and a black, cold smoke poured out. "Lucas, it's over. The elevator is standing for you tonight." The black and cold smoke pouring from the mouth of the elevator felt as though it was filling my lungs with ice. The steel edges of the elevator door shimmered in that darkness like the teeth of a shark. My legs had no power to move. It was as if that supernatural force guiding the elevator was now locked directly onto my nerves and muscles. Out of that thick fog, a bony hand, its skin clinging to the bone like old leather, gripped the edge of the door. Its long nails scraped against the metal in a way that the sound went straight to the marrow of my bones. A tall creature, with a height that reached the lobby ceiling, slowly crawled out of the cabin. It had no face. Instead of eyes and a mouth, it had only deep, black cavities that seemed to go as deep as the bottom of the elevator shaft. That creature, which I now realized was the guardian of the pit, walked toward me. The sound of its footsteps was like the collision of two pieces of wet stone on the ground. I backed away, but I hit the wall of the guard booth. The wall, which had been solid just moments ago, was now soft like flesh and seemed to be pulling me inside itself. The faceless creature raised its hand and placed its index finger on my forehead. Suddenly, all the bad memories of my life, all those moments I had been afraid or had sinned, passed before my eyes like a film on fast forward. It was weighing my heaviness. Then, with a raspy voice that seemed to come from the bottom of a well, it whispered, "Lucas, you are very heavy. You should have come to us a long time ago." Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet opened its mouth. I was thrown into the elevator shaft, but instead of hitting solid ground, I was caught in a suspended, dark space. The elevator cables wrapped around my body like giant snakes. Cold, heavy chains grabbed my wrists and ankles and dragged me downward. I passed by floors, each showing a scene of the torments of the building's residents. On the 4th floor, I saw Elena still screaming while those creatures were pulling her tongue with red-hot pliers. On the 7th floor, I saw Marco and his children forced to assemble pieces of each other's bodies like a bloody puzzle, and every time they made a mistake, their skin was peeled off. The further down I went, the more the air pressure increased. The sound of wailing and moaning from hundreds of people buried in the walls and pipes of this tower echoed in my ears. They shouted, "Lucas, welcome to the gathering. There is no time here. Here, there is only the repetition of pain." I tried to recite a prayer, but the words were matted in my mouth. It was as if even God could not hear my voice in this cursed shaft. The chains slammed me against the cold, damp wall of the pit. Suddenly, I realized that the walls were not made of bricks, but of human skulls whose eyes were still moving and watching me. At the end of this long descent, I arrived at a massive hall where the floor was flooded with foul-smelling black water. In the center of the hall sat the German architect, Hans, on a throne of bone. He no longer resembled a human being. His body was fused with electrical wires and elevator parts. Upon seeing me, Hans let out a roar of laughter that caused the black water beneath my feet to ripple, bringing fresh corpses to the surface. He said, "Lucas, did you think you were just a caretaker? No, you are the final key. For this tower to be complete, it needed the heart of someone who witnessed every crime and said nothing. Your silence is the most powerful spell for the endurance of this hell." Hans made a gesture, and two creatures that bore an uncanny resemblance to the shadows of Marco seized me and laid me on a rusted metal table. They brought an old tape recorder and pressed its microphone to my chest. Hans said, "We don't want to kill you, Lucas. We want to record your pain. Every time the elevator goes up, it is the sound of your heartbeat and your screams that set its motor in motion. You will become the soul of this machine." They brought a large drill and began boring into my chest without anesthesia. The pain was such that it felt as if thousands of hot needles were piercing my brain simultaneously. I screamed, but my voice turned into a sound frequency that went directly into the elevator cables. I felt my soul slowly leaving my body, dissolving into the black, filthy oil of the elevator motor. I was no longer Lucas. I was a part of the negative 20th floor that existed on no map. From down there, through the cracks in the shaft, I could see the sun rising and new people, oblivious to everything, coming to rent the units. They didn't know that beneath their feet, a man was losing a piece of his existence for every movement of the elevator. Now, I wait for 2 a.m. every night. Not to escape, because there is no way out anymore. I wait because when the elevator moves, I feel for a moment that I am still alive. When the elevator stops in front of a unit, I am the one who opens the door. I am that shadow that crawls through the cracks into the residents' bedrooms. I am forced to watch their agony so that I might feel less pain myself. Tonight, the elevator is going to the 11th floor. A young couple has just moved in there. I hear their laughter and my heart aches for them, because I know that in a few minutes, their laughter will turn into the recorded sound that lubricates my cables. The sound of that young couple's laughter on the 11th floor pierced through my soul like a lancet. They were talking about the arrangement of the furniture and the color of the curtains, unaware that I, Lucas, sat waiting like a wounded spider in the absolute darkness of the shaft, right behind their wall. The chains attached to my body shifted with their every move. I no longer had skin. My body was covered in a thin layer of grease and burnt oil that reeked of iron. Hans, that mad architect, shouted from below, "Lucas, it's time. Release the frequency." I didn't want to, but my body was no longer my own. Suddenly, I felt my chest split open and a supernatural voice, a violet scream that was a mixture of the voices of thousands of dying people, erupted from my throat. This sound traveled up through the cables and hit Unit 1101 like an explosion. The electricity in that unit suddenly began to spark. The young woman screamed, and her husband ran toward the fuse box. But before his hand could reach the switch, my shadow crawled in from under the door. I was watching myself tormenting them, but I couldn't stop my hands. It was as if I were a marionette whose strings were held by the devil. That night on the 11th floor, I witnessed how fear drives sane people to madness. When the young man saw that all the mirrors in his home were reflecting images of mutilated corpses, he began banging his head against the wall. I wanted to tell him to run, but my mouth only produced the sound of bones crushing. The poor woman, seeing her husband killing himself, became mute with terror. Those black creatures, my companions, crept toward her and began sucking out her warm breath. The more they sucked, the more I felt a biting cold in the shaft. This was a two-way torment, both for them and for me, the instrument of this crime. It was near dawn when the work was done. Unit 1101 was now like a silent graveyard. They dragged the bodies of those two toward the elevator. When the doors opened, the lifeless eyes of the young man fell on me, hanging in the darkness of the shaft. At that moment, I wished I could be in his place and end it, but Hans told me, "No, Lucas, death is a prize you have not yet earned. You must witness thousands more. You must become the memory of this building." The corpses fell to the bottom of the pit, and I sank back into the heavy silence of the basement. But something was changing. I realized that every time a new victim was taken, a piece of their memory remained in my mind. I could now see the memories of Marco, Elena, and James. It was as if my soul was growing larger and larger, not with light, but with darkness. I was becoming an ocean of pain. Hans thought he controlled me, but he didn't know that all this accumulated pain was itself a kind of power. I began to whisper into the cables. Not those forced screams, but a quiet murmur that only the souls trapped within the walls could hear. I told them that we must stop these gears. We must burn this machine from within. The soul of Elena, trapped on the 4th floor, was the first to answer me. With her bruised throat, she whispered back, "Lucas, we were waiting for a leader. Someone who could endure the pain and not break. Now, every night when the elevator moves, I am drawing a plan. I am learning how to send messages through the vibration of the cables. We are building an army of the dead, right beneath the feet of people who think they are living in a modern and safe tower." Tonight, it is near 2 a.m. Hans is striking the gears with his metal whips to prepare me. He thinks that tonight, like any other night, I will bring him a sacrifice. But tonight is the turn of a floor Hans never expected. Tonight, the elevator is not going to stop in front of anyone's unit. Tonight, I am steering the elevator to the place where the master key to this curse is hidden. I feel the chains loosening. I smell gasoline and sparks. I want to turn this pit into a crematorium where Hans himself will burn. The chains no longer cut my skin as they did before. It was as if my body had become one with the metal. Hans was down there, greedily pulling the steel ropes and screaming about why the elevator wasn't moving. He didn't know that with the help of Elena's and James's spirits, I had disabled the motor. Tonight at 2 a.m., the ticking of the lobby's wall clock was like the heartbeat of a dying man. I gathered all the painful energy stored in my being over these months into my hands. I felt my veins filling with hot oil. Suddenly, with a horrific jolt, the elevator began to move, but not upward. This time, the cabin was falling toward Hans's hideout at the speed of light. The scream of metal against metal rose, and purple sparks lit up the entire shaft. Hans, terrified, tried to stop me with his black magic, but the army of ghosts erupted from the walls. The cold hands of Elena and Marco reached out from between the bricks and grabbed Hans's legs. The great architect was now thrashing like a trapped rat. When the cabin hit the bottom of the pit, a massive explosion occurred that shook the entire foundation of the building. I crawled out from the wreckage of the elevator. My body no longer had its human form. I had become like a metallic monster with cold fire erupting from its eyes. I saw Hans crushed under the weight of his own gears, yet he was still breathing. I stood over him. He looked at me with terror and said, "Lucas, you cannot kill me. If I die, this building will collapse on everyone." With my raspy, multi-layered voice, I told him, "Let it collapse. Let this hell be buried under the rubble so that no elevator ever turns anyone's sleep into blood again." At that moment, I reached into Hans's chest and pulled out his black heart, which throbbed like a piece of coal. With his heart removed, the entire tower began to tremble. The screams of thousands of spirits being released filled the night sky. The walls cracked and stones began to fall. I sat beside Hans's corpse and waited for everything to end. I felt that 10-year heaviness, the guilt of fleeing the scene of the accident, finally being lifted from my shoulders. I was being buried with this building, but this time by my own choice. But destiny had a filthy joke in store for me. When the rubble collapsed upon my head and everything went dark, I thought it was finally over. But a few moments later, I heard the elevators ding once again. I opened my eyes. I found myself sitting in the guard booth once more. Perfectly fine, without a single scratch. The time was exactly 1:59 a.m. Terrified, I looked at the monitor. The elevator was on the ground floor. The doors opened, and I saw myself, wearing the caretaker's uniform, walking calmly into the elevator before the doors closed. I finally realized what had happened. I was trapped in a time loop. Hans wasn't dead. He had simply turned me into a part of the permanent cycle of torment. Now, I was the caretaker, the victim, and the executioner all at once. Every night, I had to travel this path, and every time I thought I was winning, I would be hurled back to the starting point. This was true agony, not physical torture, but a hope that is reborn every time only to be decapitated again. The elevator needle began to move. First floor, second floor, and I trembled once more. The clock on the guard booth wall ticked, as if an electric drill were being forced into my skull. Everything had started all over again. 1 minute to 2 a.m. I, Lucas, the man who thought he had destroyed the negative floor of eternity, was now like an insect trapped in amber, witnessing the repetition of my own nightmare. My hand shook, and the teacup fell from the table and shattered. The sound of breaking pottery in that heavy silence of the lobby felt like the sound of crushing bone. I stared at the floor indicator. The needle quivered. I knew what was about to happen, but I had no power to reach out and rip the power cables from their socket. It was as if every muscle in my body was filled with lead. The elevator needle didn't stop at the first floor. It passed the second and suddenly locked onto the number 5 with a violent jolt. The 5th floor. My heart was in my throat. I remembered that on the 5th floor lived a lonely old man who used to tell me stories of his warm memories in the evenings. His name was the Colonel. He was the only friend I had in this sinister tower. I screamed, "No, not tonight," but my voice was choked in my dry throat. On the monitor, I saw the elevator doors open on the 5th floor. That damned black smoke, that thick mist smelling of rusted iron, slithered out of the cabin like a hungry snake and moved toward Unit 503. Having nothing left to lose, I ran out of the booth with every ounce of strength I had. I took the stairs 2 at a time. Every step I placed my foot on felt like a living thing moaning beneath me. When I reached the 5th floor, the hallway was drowned in darkness. Only a faint blue light leaked from under the Colonel's door. I pressed my ear to the door. I heard the Colonel's voice. He was talking to someone. He said, "Lucas? Is that you, my boy? Why have you come at this hour? Why does your face look like that?" My body went ice cold. He was seeing me, the same Lucas who had turned into a metallic monster in the previous part. I kicked the door open. The scene I saw will be etched into my mind forever. The Colonel stood in the middle of the living room, smiling at a metallic, hideous creature that bore a terrifying resemblance to me. That monster, the distorted version of myself, had its blade-like hands wrapped around the Colonel's neck. I wanted to shout, "Colonel, run!" But the creature turned and looked at me. Its eyes were exactly my eyes, but filled with hatred and black oil. It spoke with my own voice. "Lucas, you cannot escape from yourself. Every time the elevator stops, it is you who is killing your neighbors. I am merely the instrument of your hidden will." A strange pain twisted in my chest. It felt as if every blow the monster dealt to the Colonel, I felt it too. The creature dragged the Colonel toward the balcony. I ran to stop it, but my feet sank into the ceramic floor. The tiles had become like quicksand. The Colonel looked at me with eyes full of tears and said, "Lucas, why?" And then, that monster threw the old man down from the 5th floor. The sound of the Colonel's body hitting the asphalt of the street echoed through my entire being. At that moment, the elevator in the hallway let out a loud ding, as if it had just scored a new point. I lay on the floor wailing. The metallic monster slowly approached me. It placed the sharp edge of its hand on my stomach and said, "Now it's time for the main part of the game. You must understand who Hans was. Hans wasn't an architect. Hans was the first caretaker of this building who, like you, wanted to play the hero. And now, you are the new Hans." The creature ripped my stomach open in such a way that all the contents of my being, which were no longer blood but had turned into cables and wires, spilled out. I was slowly becoming a part of the building's wiring. I felt my soul spreading through the elevator cables. Now I was in every unit. The sound of children crying, the romantic whispers of couples, it was all inside my head. I had become the ears of this tower. Hans, whose spirit was now suspended in the hallway air, whispered in my ear, "Lucas, now that you have become one with all the residents, it's time to experience the heaviest sin. You must choose which door the elevator will stop in front of tomorrow night. If you don't choose, the elevator will stop in front of your own room. And this time, your death will not be eternal, but a 1,000-fold repetition of a pain that never ends." Choice. This word was splitting my brain in two like a sharp axe. I, Lucas, was now neither man nor monster. I had become that damned elevator itself. I felt the steel cables like veins of my own body stretching from the shaft to behind the doors of the units. I heard the heartbeats of all the building's residents in my head. Unit 304, a single mother holding her child. Unit 602, an exhausted student studying. That bastard Hans was right. Now the power was in my hands. But this power reeked of rot. If I didn't make a choice, that metallic monster made of my own sins would come for me again to melt me into those endless gears. The clock was approaching 2 a.m. again. This time stretched as if every second lasted a century. In that ravaged state, with my stomach torn open and wires spilling out, I dragged myself to the main elevator control panel in the basement machine room. It smelled of hot oil and ozone. Hans stood there, or rather, his ghost circled the motor like thick blue smoke, laughing. He told me, "Hurry, Lucas. Feel the heaviness of the souls. Which of them deserves to meet the guardian of the pit tonight? Which of them is the most cowardly?" Shaking, I reached my hand toward the manual floor lever. The vibration of the cables beneath my fingers told me what each floor tasted like. The 8th floor tasted of betrayal, the 2nd floor of greed. But suddenly, my eyes fell on the caretaker's unit, my own little booth on the ground floor. I saw a new Lucas, a simple and oblivious man who had just arrived and was arranging his things in the booth. That was me, before this hell began. Suddenly, a mad thought entered my head. If I could cut this cycle right here, perhaps all those trapped spirits would be freed. Hans, as if he had read my mind, shrieked, "No, you cannot change the plan. If you harm yourself, this entire tower will turn into a black hole that swallows us all." But I was no longer listening. I gathered all my strength. Instead of sending the elevator up, I ripped out all the emergency brakes at once. The horrific sound of steel cables snapping echoed through the building like a thunderclap. The heavy elevator cabin, which was at the highest floor, began a deadly freefall toward the bottom of the shaft, straight toward where Hans and I stood. In those few seconds of falling, I heard the breaking of the spell. I saw the spirits of Elena, Marco, James, and the Colonel erupting from the walls like sparks of light and flying toward the sky. They were free. With a bone-shattering sound that seemed to split the earth in two, the cabin crashed onto the machine room and my body. I felt my bones and wires crushed under tons of iron. The pain was indescribable, yet it held a strange peace. Absolute darkness took over everything. For the first time in all this time, the clock passed 2 a.m. and no scream was heard. I opened my eyes. I expected to be in hell, but I saw myself standing in a white, infinite space. No cables were attached to my body anymore, and I no longer smelled of oil. I saw the Colonel standing far off, waving at me. But suddenly, I heard a sound, the familiar ding of the elevator. I turned around and saw a polished steel door behind me. The door opened. No one was inside, but there was a mirror on the opposite wall. I stepped forward and looked at myself. I was no longer 35-year-old Lucas. I had become Hans himself, with the same surgical gown and the same cold gaze. I realized that this game has no end. I killed Hans, so now I am Hans. The doors closed, and the elevator began to rise again. This time toward a new world, a new tower, and a new Lucas who was walking on the sidewalk to come and become the caretaker. The nightmare does not repeat. The nightmare only changes its clothes.